Good day dear peeps and a cold welcome back to a Hollow game we all know and love and its newly announced sequel, Hollow Knight Silksong. That is if it's even a sequel, because yeah, that's how much we know about it. But a couple of months ago I made a video talking about what we knew about Silksong at that point, gathering every teensy bit of information available so Hollow Knight fans could get an overview of what kind of presents we could expect to get. But let's just say that Team Cherry have not avoided the subject in an amateurish manner, but they've actually managed to keep the game's entire existence a secret for a whole 2 years. Also meaning that the game is currently pretty deep in development stages and might even be released this year, if we're lucky. However, that also means it's a little late to come with any drastic suggestions on how they could switch up the gameplay, world, or in this case story, in attempts to make it unique and improve it, but it does mean that Team Cherry's scope and idea of the game is about to be chiseled into bedrock, and with some reasonable updates on the game, then we'll be able to come up with solid theories on what the game is going to be like in its final state. And whether or not if it's actually different from Hollow Knight in major aspects, or if it's gonna be mostly exactly the same. And for me personally, then actually what interests me the most is the story, and trust me, before you start groaning about how story is irrelevant to the Metroidvania genre, then just shush for a second, because there might actually be a vastly different story in Silksong, all due to a very simple detail. Hornet can talk. This change might seem simple at a first glance, until you remember that one of the most important aspects that locked Hollow Knight into its specific narrative was the design decision to have a silent protagonist, who functioned more like a communicative tool for the player than a genuine character, because they don't have any character traits. We know near nothing about them or how they would act on their own in a certain situation. But that's just talking about the Knight. If we talk about Hornet, then this gets a lot less ambiguous. We know she's stubborn, we know she's crafty, royal in stature and very proud, but also that she's a bug that cares about the outcome of the world, otherwise she wouldn't have helped us in the last boss fight of the game. This change in Protagonist is huge, because it actually offers Team Cherry a chance to move away from the Dark Souls-like story progression and narrative that they've stuck to maybe more than they even wanted to in Hollow Knight. And don't get on me like that, that's not just to bring up Dark Souls out of nowhere, but if you actually compare the two games, then there's a lot of similarities between the two. Like, for example, a silent protagonist that explores a grey and grim world at their own pace, and a world that also so happens to be in a semi-post-apocalyptic setting, with bigger-than-life problems and monsters to face that the player has to fight on their own, with most of the actual story being hidden in the environmental storytelling. They kinda rack up after a while. But it's not that this narrative is in any way bad at all, because it really isn't. And I certainly hope Team Cherry sticks to the thick environmental storytelling and absolutely pristine world building that made Hollow Knight so beautifully serene and at the same time creepy and mysterious. But having said that, then it's also pretty hard to counter-argue that the Hollow Knight story structure certainly seems to be different from what we might be getting in Silksong. And this is because Hornet is a protagonist that allows for an actual story arc, with emotional and personal boss encounters and an ever-evolving character that we can fall in love with all over again, because that's what I want. I don't want a character that I don't really care about. I want a character that I'll care for in the beginning, but even more so by the end of the game. And I really hope that that's the direction that Team Cherry decides to aim for, even though they might lack experience in this specific department of storytelling. But because we're also discussing what the game could be like, then I have to mention the other very likely directions that the developers could decide to take the narrative. Although they are probably more boring because they're definitely safer from like a design perspective. But there is a chance that they potentially just completely went back on what they established about the talkative Hornet in Hollow Knight and instead made her weirdly silent for the sequel, almost turning her into like a Knight 2.0, leaving the narrative somewhat unchanged from the original, which would maintain the formula but wouldn't really be good for a character. But what I think is the most likely direction when it comes to what Hornet's character is going to mean for the narrative structure of Silksong, then it's sadly still not something spectacular. A lot of people love Hornet, and a lot of people love the idea of going through an adventure alongside her, seeing her character start as this ambiguous bug we saw in Hollow Knight, and then evolve through struggle and fight to become a fully fledged, relatable character. But Team Cherry also started building a formula in Hollow Knight, where the world as a whole is in focus. You rarely stay in one place for too long, so you can only get tidbits of information from individual struggles, leaving much to little room for character development. So, even though they've now got a character that's constantly with you and has room for a really interesting personal vendetta or an emotional story and emotional climax, then they might just stick with the original narrative, since that might be too much of a core idea behind what Hollow Knight is to give up on. Which, I mean, would be a perfectly fine argument, but the leading result of this train of decisions would likely be a little bittersweet. Because it'll certainly be more Hollow Knight, and it certainly won't disappoint fans, not in gameplay and especially not in world building, but I won't lie that it'll be a little bit of a depressing thought to keep around in the back of my mind, imagining what could have been. When I sit there playing the ending of Silksong and it doesn't go out with the emotional bang that I hoped, but it instead fizzes out like a flat soda. And who knows, the story might even come to a complete close with Hornet dying in the end, her character still shallow and somewhat unexplored, just like her predecessor. But hey, wait a minute, why are we sitting here discussing this if we can, just ask Team Cherry themselves? Because that's exactly what I did. I listed the most important points of this video and then sent them to them, and we'll see if I get a response. And you know what, if I get an answer from them, then I'll pin it in the comment section below, and then we can have new estimates of how exactly important Hornet's character will be to the narrative of Silksong. So while my desperate message is getting processed in their pile of fan mail, then I want you to write your theories about Silksong. What do you think the main plot will be? Why do you think Hornet needs to get to the top of the kingdom? And who is the silver lass who's hunting her throughout this whole thing? All of those questions and much more I want you to leave below. And in the meantime, then we can do nothing but just hope. Hope and support. Remember that Team Cherry is still not just a small, but a somewhat inexperienced indie team, and asking them to break a formula that got them so popular last time is a really freaking tall order, and they should get absolutely no shame for not breaking that. But Team Cherry, if you're listening, then will win over my heart 100% if you dare to take that risk and make Hornet's character fantastic.